Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Skive Facebook Live talk, which is very much focused on artificial intelligence. And we try to cover topics that are not so obvious or something that you hear about, but it's hard to find more information about that. Very, very quickly again, we are Skive. We are building machines that feel. So we are a deep learning startup based here in San Francisco with offices in London. And yes, we are hiring. And today's topic relates to responsible AI. Just as a recap, we covered responsible AI last time, and today we will be focusing on some of the ethical issues that relates to artificial intelligence, which is a subpart of the whole discipline called responsible AI. Sometimes it's called principled AI. Responsible AI includes ethics, obviously, which will take some questions. Secondly, it relates to transparency. The third, it relates to regulation and control. When can it be used? How can it be used? How should autonomous weapons be regulated? The next, it relates to the social economic impact of such technologies like autonomous systems or artificial intelligence and digitary. The next, it relates to design. And lastly, the responsibility itself. Just because you can build something doesn't mean you could use it commercially or you should be using it. When we talk about ethics in context of artificial intelligence, there's a couple of things that comes into picture. At the bottom is about the fundamental rights of human beings, the respect for human dignity. There's so much you can do today using deep learning, whether supervised deep learning or unsupervised, or even simple machine learning. We have all heard about deepfakes. We have also heard about how some of these autonomous weapons have been used in the world, sometimes for good and sometimes for not so good. Freedom of the individual has become really important, especially when some of these artificial intelligence systems are data driven. Can you collect all the possible data from all the cell phones and track somebody? Probably not. And these things vary country to country based on what their constitution or laws and regulations says. Respect for democracy, justice, and the rule of law. And that is becoming very important. And you see two varying world. One where it's a lot about non-liberal democracies or autocracies, and the other is liberal democracies. And artificial intelligence can do a lot of harm and good at the same time. Equality, non-discrimination is super important. A lot of the biases in artificial intelligence system that's being built and trained using data that's being collected by scientists, that's being collected by a lot of other organizations and corporations, becomes really important. And that's where it becomes very important to make sure that these systems are not biased and they are not leading to inequality. Citizens' right is the last one. Let's see if we have some questions. So we do have one question, and before we go into that, let me just to summarize the four important pieces of ethics in context of artificial intelligence systems in this world. The first is respect for human autonomy. The second is prevention of harm. AI should be used to do good to humans. Fairness, we talked about the bias. And then the last one, and explicability. And this is interesting because it relates to how much explicit can you be in building and deploying these artificial intelligence systems. It relates to something we talked in the past about transparency and explainability of AI system. And as we know where we are going in the future, when some of these systems are based on how our human brain behaves, which is unsupervised learning, it may not be possible to really explain how our AI decision making system decided. It's a similar thing as a judge. We all, humans, our brains are, after all, a Bayesian inference system. We make mistakes, and so does machine. Even a judge can make mistakes. And that's where some of these things may play important roles. Sometimes it may not be able, we may not be able to achieve it. Okay, let's take questions. So our first question is, what balance should lay between environment, human, and animal ethics in AI design? Ethics in general, when you're talking about AI design or AI systems, is to do good to human beings. Because after all, it's for our use. But at the same time, there's a balance between what we have to gain and what harm we could get using these AI systems to somebody else, and not just to human beings. And environment is obviously one such thing. Yes, we could deforest all the forests in the world, but that's not really good for us in the long term. We could also figure out what minerals are there on Earth, and using various techniques from remote sensing to analytics using artificial intelligence. And that's where the area is a little bit gray, and we have seen that some regimes and some governments are good and some are not in terms of having a good decision process. And that's what really it relates to the human rights and the importance of these AI systems to us in the humanity. Animal ethics is also important. We as scientists do have to decide that. Yes, we have some regulations around what we can or cannot do with animals. Can we test something like a vaccine on a rat to figure out whether it will work for human beings? I believe yes. Can we use artificial intelligence to replicate the functionality in a genome of a lizard, which may have something interesting? And the answer is probably yes. Can we make artificial meat? The answer is again yes. And all these things have been achieved through artificial intelligence. And the vaccine that we have built for this pandemic is a great example of it, where these have been tested on animals in the past. And for example, the mRNA, it's not a new technique. It has been there for ages. But there's still a balance that needs to be there needs to be between what artificial intelligence can do and what it should do today and in the future. Our second question is, what are some of the examples of practical behaviors in regards to ethics in AI? Data mining is a great example if you look at it. Right now, it is possible to track where we are, what we are doing at any point of time. There are many, many sensor inputs available. We have satellites and constellation satellites there, which has really high definition cameras. They can track where we are, what we are doing. Drones are an extension to that. If you couple that with the data our cell phones provide and can sense, they know where we are, what we are doing, who we are talking to, who have we interacted with. If you combine all that information, and there are situations where it's being used for the good, actually. Contact tracing is right now in this pandemic world is one where it is being used for good. There are other examples where it has not been used for good in some of the authoritarian regimes where it's being used to track not just criminals, just to track opposition parties. That's practical behavior that to some extent goes against the ethical principle of AI where it should be used. There are other examples where artificial intelligence is being used for the greater good. For example, now we have autonomous submarines that's being used in the oceans to figure out how the oceans are behaving with global warming. It's being also used to track on a much larger scale what is the weather pattern, using sensors that are spread around both on the oceans as well as on the ground. And some of those practical application and use cases are important, and it's important today, and it's even more important to figure out what are the policies that we need to get in place. Tracking down fires in Amazon forest, and not just in Amazon forest, right here in California. Artificial intelligence to predict where a specific fire could be, or how do you in real time figure out there is a fire. This is where AI could very well help, as long as we have those core ethical principles in place, which again is respect for humanity, or human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. Let's see if we have one more question. So our next question is it possible for humans to overachieve the design of AI and reach a point where we develop a machine that is smarter than us? When will that happen, and what can we do now to avoid us from reaching the end of humanity? So there are two different questions here. I will try to answer both of them. So first is how to achieve artificial intelligence or a machine or an AI machine that's smarter than us. I would contest that to some extent when we just talk about intelligence. So here we're talking about IQ as opposed to EQ. Some of the AI systems or some of the intelligence systems we have even today could achieve a lot what human beings can do today. But that's just on the pure intelligence part. We are still not talking about super intelligence. And if we look at some of the new techniques in artificial intelligence, self-supervised learning or reinforcement learning or unsupervised learning, are ways which do mimic how our human brain actually behaves, how kids learn. When you are small, when you are 3 weeks old, the only thing you know that time as a kid is your mom. And why is that? Because mom is the source of food. If you don't smile at her, you know you will die. So the only thing that kid recognizes that time is her mom, because she's the source of food. And then we evolve. That's where some of these unsupervised learning techniques, including reinforcement learning techniques, come into picture. These are available today, although the number of systems that are based on these techniques are very small. I would say less than 5%. The other 95% is supervised learning. But going forward, as the compute become much more available and we are able to more commercially use these algorithms, it is possible to achieve superintelligence. But that will be still different than some of the things that we human beings are really good at. Consciousness. That relates to ethics to some extent. Common sense. And that will be the harder part. And well, although I will also say that those are different than just being smart. Although, if you look at the stock market or the stock brokers, or if you look at some of the investors, or even the startup founders and entrepreneurs, they're smart not just because they know a lot about a specific discipline. They are people person. They're able to make common sense decisions, and that's the harder thing. The second part of the question was was what can we do now to avoid us from reaching the end of humanity? And I believe that relates to the first question, which is we should not be just building machines that are smarter than us. It's not just about the IQ, it's about building a machine that has all the characteristics of what makes somebody ethical: consciousness, common sense, to focus on the greater good, and as opposed to just pure intelligence. We know if something is really super intelligent and it's intelligent at us, it could probably create things that also are intelligent then in itself, and that's not a good thing. What us human beings are to some extent constrained is the common sense. It's a consciousness. It's also the laws and regulations of how a human society behaves, or how we human needs to behave in the human society. That sort of regulation is what has evolved from the past, and what at least the US legal system or the UK legal system is based on, which is called the Napoleon Code. So we need something like that for artificial intelligence, so that it should not do just because it can do. Quantum computing is already here. Processors are becoming much more powerful. Storage is becoming more and more cheaper. So just because we can do something doesn't mean AI system should be able to do it. Or in other words, we humans should be building it.